Your daily bridge to fluency starts right now. I'm VA, and let's master your English flow.
Ulysses by James Joyce. Chapter 1. The Young Man and the Morning Sea. The story begins on a bright morning in early summer. The sun rose over Dublin Bay, and the light was strong and clear. The colors of the morning were gold and white. They shone on the water and on the stone walls of an old tower. This tower stood near the edge of the sea. It was round and built of heavy gray stone. On top of the tower, a young man named Stephen Dedalus stepped out into the air. He was not happy. He looked tired and thin. He wore a black suit that looked dusty. He wore black because he was in mourning. His mother had died recently, and the sadness was still heavy in his heart. Another young man was there with him. This man was named Buck Mulligan. He was different from Stephen. He was loud, plump, and full of energy. He laughed often and made jokes that hurt Stephen's feelings. Mulligan held a bowl of soapy water to shave his face. The white foam in the bowl looked like the white clouds in the sky. He held a mirror and looked at himself, smiling at the morning. Stephen looked at the sea. The water was deep and green. Mulligan pointed to the ocean and called it a great, sweet mother. But these words made Stephen feel cold. When he looked at the sea, he did not see a sweet mother. He remembered his own mother lying in her bed. He remembered the smell of sickness and the white flowers in her room. He felt a sharp pain in his chest. It was the pain of guilt. His mother had asked him to pray for her before she died, but he had refused. He had said no because he did not believe in the church anymore. Now, her memory haunted him like a ghost in the daylight. The two men ate breakfast inside the dark living room of the tower. An Englishman lived with them, too. The room felt crowded. Stephen felt like a stranger in his own home. Mulligan asked for the key to the tower. Stephen gave it to him. He realized then that he was a dispossessed son. This meant he had no real home and no power. The tower did not belong to him anymore. He was like a prince who had lost his kingdom. He decided he would not sleep there that night. He had to leave. Stephen left the tower and walked to his job. He worked at a school for young boys. The air inside the school was different from the gold and white morning. Here, the colors were brown and dusty. Stephen tried to teach the boys about history. They read from books about old battles and ancient kings. But the boys were restless. They did not care about the past. After the lesson, Stephen spoke to the headmaster of the school. The headmaster was an old man who thought he was very wise. He talked about money and the history of Ireland. He told Stephen that money was the most important thing. Stephen listened, but he felt bored and tired. The old man's wisdom felt like dry dust. It was the wisdom of a world that was dying. Stephen felt trapped by history, just as he felt trapped by the memory of his mother. Stephen left the school. He needed to be alone. He walked down to the beach called Sandymount Strand. It was later in the morning now. The tide was coming in. The water moved back and forth over the sand. This was a place of change. Stephen walked on the crushing shells and damp sand. The color of the world seemed to shift to blue and gray. He thought about how everything in the world changes. Nothing stays the same shape forever. The water turned into mist. The land turned into mud. Even people changed. They grew old and died, and their bodies returned to the earth. He closed his eyes as he walked. He wanted to hear the world without seeing it. He heard the crunch of his boots on the shells. He heard the rush of the waves. He thought about his life. He was a poet and a thinker, but he felt lost. He thought about his father, a man who had many different jobs and voices, but who had left Stephen with nothing. Stephen looked at the water again. The tide was flowing in, covering the rocks. His thoughts were like the tide. They flowed from one idea to another. He thought about words and how they could capture the world. He wanted to write a book that would last forever, but right now, he was just a young man walking alone by the sea. He saw a ship in the distance. It was moving silently across the horizon. It was a sign of travel and the outside world. Stephen knew he could not stay in Dublin forever. He felt the need to change his own life, just as the sea changed the shape of the shore. He was sad, but he was also awake. The long day was just beginning. Chapter 2. Breakfast and the Long Carriage Ride. While Stephen Dedalus walked alone by the gray sea, the sun was shining brightly on the other side of Dublin. It was 8 o'clock in the morning at number 7 Eccles Street. Here, a man named Leopold Bloom was beginning his day. Leopold Bloom was a different kind of man than Stephen. He was older, and he did not think about high philosophy or history. He thought about the world through his senses. He loved the physical feeling of life. Most of all, he loved to eat. He did not like plain beef or chicken. He liked the thick, rich meats from the inside of animals. He liked thick giblet soup, nutty gizzards, a stuffed roast heart, and liver slices fried with crusts. But most of all, he liked grilled mutton kidneys. He liked the strong, sharp taste on his tongue. The kitchen was quiet. Bloom moved around softly. He was a gentle man who liked to serve others. He poured milk for the cat. The black cat walked around his legs, purring loudly. Bloom watched the cat and wondered how the world looked to her green eyes. He spoke to her kindly, and she cried out for food. He gave her the milk and watched her drink. He decided to go to the butcher to buy a kidney for his breakfast. He walked out into the bright morning sunshine. The air was fresh. He felt happy to be walking. He looked at the houses and the people. He thought about his wife, Molly. She was still asleep in the big bed upstairs. Bloom loved her very much, but he also worried about her. He knew she was going to meet a man named Blazes Boylan later that day. The thought made a small shadow in his mind, but he pushed it away. When he returned, he cooked the kidney in the frying pan. The smell of burning meat filled the kitchen. It was a pungent, heavy smell, but to Bloom it smelled like home. He prepared a tray for Molly. He brought her tea and bread and butter in bed. She was soft and warm under the covers. He served her like a servant serves a queen. Then he went back downstairs to eat his own breakfast. He sat alone. He ate the kidney with great enjoyment. He read a letter from his daughter, Millie, who was away working in a photography shop. He felt a mix of pride and loneliness. His children were growing up, or they were gone. After breakfast, Bloom left the house again. It was time to go into the city. He walked through the streets, letting the sights and sounds wash over him. He stopped at the post office to pick up a secret letter. It was from a woman named Martha, but it was not a serious love affair. It was just a game of words. Bloom felt a little thrill of secrecy. He felt sticky from the humid morning air. He wanted to feel clean. He went to a public bathhouse. He lay in the warm water looking at his own body. He saw his pale skin and the dark hair on his chest. In the water, he felt weightless. He felt calm. For a moment, the problems of the world melted away like the steam rising from the bath. He was just a body floating in warmth. But the calm could not last. It was 11 o'clock. Bloom had a duty to perform. A man named Paddy Dignam had died, and today was the funeral. Bloom dressed in his black suit. It felt stiff and heavy after the warm bath. He joined 3 other men in a carriage to ride to the cemetery. The inside of the carriage smelled of musty leather and old clothes. Bloom sat with Simon Dedalus, who was Stephen's father, and 2 other men named Mr. Power and Mr. Cunningham. They rode through the streets of Dublin. The carriage shook and bumped over the stones. Through the window, Bloom watched the city pass by. He saw people walking, working, and laughing. They were alive, but inside the carriage, the mood was dark. The men talked about death. They talked about how Paddy Dignam had died suddenly. They said it was a breakdown of the heart. Bloom thought about the human heart. To him, it was not a symbol of love or romance. It was a pump. It was a piece of meat like the kidney he ate for breakfast. It pumped blood through the body thousands of times a day. And then, one day, it just stopped. It was a terrifying thought. As they rode, they saw blazes boiling on the street. Bloom felt a sharp pain in his chest, but he did not say anything. He looked at his fingernails. He tried to hide his feelings. He felt like an outsider in the carriage. The other men were loud and confident. Bloom was quiet and Jewish, and he often felt that he did not fully belong in their world. They arrived at Glasnevin Cemetery. The gates were open. The place was full of white stones and green grass. It was a city of the dead. Bloom walked with the other men behind the coffin. The air was cold and damp here. He smelled the wet earth and the scent of crushed flowers. Bloom looked at the graves. He thought about how many people were buried here. Thousands and thousands of people who once walked and talked and ate breakfast. Now they were just bones in the ground. He thought about his own father, Rudolph. His father had been a sad man who killed himself many years ago. The memory was a heavy stone in Bloom's heart. He also thought about his son, Ruddy. Ruddy had died when he was just a baby, only 11 days old. If Ruddy had lived, he would be almost a man now. Bloom imagined a version of his son walking beside him, but there was only empty air. The priest read the prayers. The men took off their hats. The coffin was lowered into the deep, dark hole. The sound of the dirt hitting the wood was final and hollow. Bloom watched calmly. He did not cry. He thought about the chemistry of the body. The body goes into the earth, and the earth feeds the grass. It was a cycle. It was the descent to nothingness, but it was also natural. He saw a rat crawling near one of the crypts. It was fat and gray. The other men did not see it. Bloom watched the rat slide into the darkness. He thought about how life continues, even in a graveyard. The rat was alive. The worms were alive. The caretakers were alive. Bloom wanted to be with the living. He did not want to stay here with the cold stones and the memories of the dead. The funeral ended. The men turned away from the grave. Their mood changed quickly. They started talking about normal things again. They talked about politics and money. They were ready to go back to the city, to the pubs, and to the noise of life. Bloom walked with them, but his mind was still moving between the two worlds. He was a man of the body, hungry for lunch, but he had looked into the face of death. He was Leopold Bloom, a father without a son, a husband with a wandering wife, walking back into the heart of Dublin. Chapter 3: Wind Machines and Hunger. Leopold Bloom left the quiet of the graveyard and returned to the noisy heart of Dublin. The city was awake now. The streets were full of trams and carts. Bloom had work to do. He was an ad canvasser. This meant his job was to help businesses put advertisements in the newspaper. He needed to visit the offices of the Freeman's Journal. As he entered the newspaper building, the noise hit him like a physical blow. It was the sound of the printing presses. Thump, thump, thump. The floor shook under his feet. The great machines were made of heavy iron and steel. They moved back and forth with a steady rhythm. To Bloom, the machines sounded like they were breathing. The building was like a giant body, and this room was the lungs. The machines inhaled and exhaled, pumping out pages of news instead of air. Everything here was loud. The doors swung back and forth in the draft. The wind blew through the hallways. It rustled the papers on the desks and made the gas lights flicker. People were shouting to be heard over the noise of the presses. The editor, a man named Miles Crawford, was yelling about a speech. He was a red-faced man who spoke with great energy. Words flew through the air like leaves in a storm. Bloom tried to talk to him about an advertisement for a tea merchant named Keys, but it was hard to focus. The wind, the noise, and the machines made Bloom feel small. The world of words was windy and chaotic. Bloom walked out of the office and back onto the street. It was lunch time. The noise of the machines faded, but a new feeling took its place. Hunger. He felt an empty space in his stomach. It was a hollow ache. He began to think about food. He thought about the tube in his throat, the esophagus, waiting to swallow. He walked past shops that smelled of baking bread and roasting meat. The smells were thick in the air. His body wanted fuel. He was just a machine, too, in a way. He needed to eat to keep moving. He walked toward a place called the Burton Restaurant. He thought he might eat there. He opened the door and looked inside. The sight made him stop. The room was crowded with men. They were sitting on stools, hunched over their plates. The air was hot and smelled of grease and meat. Bloom watched them eat. It was not a pretty sight. The men were tearing at the meat with their teeth. They were chewing with their mouths open. He saw a man with a knife covered in gravy. He saw a man spitting gristle onto his plate. It looked violent. The room seemed to be washed in a color of blood red. It was the red of raw beef and the red faces of the men stuffing themselves. It looked like a feeding frenzy of animals, not a lunch for men. I cannot eat here, Bloom thought. It was too loud and too dirty. The sight of the men shoveling food into their mouths made his own hunger feel different. He felt a sudden wave of tiredness. It was a feeling of abatement, a slowing down. He did not want to fight for food. He wanted peace. He turned away from the Burton and walked to a quieter place called Davy Byon's Pub. It was a moral pub, calm and cool. He went inside and sat down. The air here was still. There were no clanking machines and no wolves tearing at meat. He ordered a glass of burgundy wine and a cheese sandwich. The barman cut the sandwich into strips. Bloom took a bite. It was gorgonzola cheese. It tasted sharp and mustardy. He took a sip of the wine. It was smooth and warm. He felt the food traveling down his throat, filling the empty space. Bloom sat there, chewing slowly. He looked at the wood of the bar counter. He felt the tiredness in his legs. The morning had been long. He had seen death at the funeral. He had heard the loud wind of the newspaper office, and he had seen the animal hunger of the men. Now he just wanted to rest. He thought about his wife, Molly. He remembered the first time they met. The wine made him feel warm and a little sad. He was a man resting in the middle of a long day, gathering his strength to go back out into the city. Chapter 4: The Library and the Labyrinth. The afternoon sun was high, but inside the National Library of Dublin, the light was soft and dim. It was a quiet place. The walls were lined with thousands of books. They smelled of old paper, leather, and dust. This was a place for the mind. If the city outside was a body, this room was the brain. Stephen Dedalus stood in the center of this quiet room. He was surrounded by scholars and poets. These were the smart men of the city. They wore serious faces and spoke in low, hushed voices. But the air between them was tense. It felt like a battlefield, but the weapons were not swords. The weapons were words. Stephen was trying to explain a theory. He was talking about William Shakespeare and his famous play, Hamlet. Stephen spoke with passion. He believed that the play was not just a story. He believed it was about Shakespeare's own life. He said the ghost in the play was Shakespeare himself, calling out to his dead son. The other men listened, but they did not agree. They smiled tight little smiles. They quoted other books. They used big words to push Stephen's ideas away. Stephen felt his mind working fast. He had to be quick. He had to be sharp. He felt like he was fencing, dodging their attacks and striking back with his own clever thoughts. But it was lonely work. Even though he was talking to people, Stephen felt isolated. These men did not understand his heart. They only cared about dry facts. Stephen felt a deep sadness. He was a young man seeking a spiritual father, just as he claimed Shakespeare was seeking his son. The library was full of knowledge, but it was empty of love. Stephen finished his argument. The air was thick with the dust of old ideas. He turned and walked out of the room. He passed a man coming in, a man with a dark suit and sad eyes. It was Leopold Bloom. They passed each other like two ships in the night. They did not speak. They did not know that their lives were weaving together. Stephen stepped out of the quiet library and into the street. The change was sudden. The piece of the brain was gone. Now he was in the labyrinth. The streets of Dublin were a maze. They twisted and turned like a tangle of knots. The city was busy. It was chaotic. If the library was the brain, the streets were the veins. The people were the blood cells rushing through the body of the city. Bloom was part of this flow now. He walked along the river Liffey. He looked at the shop windows. He was looking for a book to buy for his wife, Molly. He wanted something exciting for her to read. He found a book called Sweets of Sin. He hoped she would like it. Around him, the city moved without stopping. Carts rattled over the cobblestones. Horses neighed and stamped their feet. Bells rang from the church towers. It was a wall of sound. The people in the streets were all moving in different directions. A priest walked one way, nodding to people. A group of soldiers marched another way. A beggar held out a dirty hand. They were all close to each other, bumping shoulders and stepping on toes. But they were strangers. It was a hostile environment. It was hard to connect with anyone here. The city was too fast. It was too loud. Everyone was trapped in their own little path through the maze. They were like wandering rocks, drifting and crashing but never staying still. Suddenly, a hush fell over the busy street. The traffic stopped. The people on the sidewalk turned their heads. A grand carriage was coming down the road. It was the Lord Lieutenant of Ireland, the representative of the British King. The carriage rolled past. The horses were shiny and strong. The officials inside looked out at the people with bored faces. The citizens of Dublin watched them go. Some people cheered. Some people bowed. Others just watched with cold eyes. Bloom watched the carriage pass. He saw the flash of gold and the spinning wheels. For a moment, the whole city stopped its chaotic movement to watch this symbol of power. It was the only thing that made the maze pause. Then the carriage turned a corner and was gone. The noise returned instantly. The carts started moving. The people began to walk again. The blood of the city continued to flow. Bloom adjusted his hat and kept walking. He was just one small man in a giant, stony labyrinth trying to find his way home. Chapter 5. S.O.N.G.S. and the Angry Giant. The afternoon sun began to dip lower in the sky. The bright light of the day turned into the soft shadows of the evening. Leopold Bloom felt tired. He had walked many miles through the stone maze of Dublin. His feet were sore and his heart was heavy. He needed a place to rest. He needed to stop moving for a little while. He found his way to the Ormond Hotel. It was a grand place near the river. As he walked toward the door, he could hear sounds spilling out into the street. It was not the sound of traffic or shouting. It was the sound of music. Bloom entered the hotel bar. The air was cool and smelled of food and drink. He sat down in a quiet corner to eat his dinner. The room was focused on one thing. It was the ear. Everyone in the room was listening. Two women stood behind the bar. They were the barmaids. They laughed and poured drinks. They looked at their own reflections in the big mirror. They were beautiful, like the magical women in old stories who sang to sailors to make them crash their ships. A man sat at the piano in the center of the room. His name was Simon Dedalus. He began to play a song. His voice was high and clear. He sang about lost love and broken hearts. The notes floated through the air like invisible birds. The men in the bar stopped talking. They held their glasses still. They listened with their eyes closed. Bloom listened too. The music was beautiful, but it was painful. It was a sweet deceit. The song made sadness feel like something lovely. It made loneliness feel romantic. But Bloom knew the truth. He looked at the clock. He knew that at this very moment his wife Molly was likely with another man. The song pulled at his heartstrings. It made him feel very small and very alone. He felt like he was just a shell, just an ear taking in the sad sounds of the world. The music swelled and filled the room, wrapping everyone in a blanket of sound. Bloom finished his meal quickly. The song was too much for him. He had to escape the sweet trap of the music. He walked back out into the street. The air was fresh. He needed to go to a meeting at a different place. He walked toward a part of the city that was rougher and darker. He arrived at a pub called Barney Kiernan's. This place was very different from the hotel. There was no sweet music here. There was only shouting. The air was thick with the smell of stale beer and tobacco smoke. It was a place of anger and muscle. In the corner of the dark pub sat a huge man. He was broad and heavy. He looked like a giant from a nightmare. The people called him the Citizen. He was an old nationalist who wanted Ireland to be free from England. But his love for his country had turned into something hard and cruel. He wore the color green to show his loyalty. To him, green was the only color that mattered. Beside the giant sat a fierce dog named Gary Owen. The dog had sharp teeth and growled at anyone who came near. The Citizen sat like a king on a throne of barrels. He shouted about politics. He talked about violence and force. He wanted to punish anyone who was not like him. Bloom walked into this den of lions. He was looking for a friend, but he found only enemies. The Citizen saw Bloom and narrowed his eyes. He did not like Bloom. Bloom was quiet. Bloom was Jewish. To the giant, Bloom was a stranger who did not belong in Ireland. The men in the pub began to talk about money and sports. The giant spoke loudly about hanging people and fighting wars. He wanted everyone to be afraid. He represented fanaticism and terror. He believed that force was the only way to solve problems. Bloom tried to stay out of the argument, but the giant kept pushing him. The Citizen made mean jokes about Bloom. The other men laughed. The atmosphere in the room grew tense. It felt like a storm was about to break. The green anger of the giant filled the space. Most men would have stayed silent. Most men would have run away. But Leopold Bloom did something brave. He stood up to the giant. He did not use his fists. He used his words. Bloom spoke about injustice. He said it was wrong to hate people just because they were different. He told the giant that force was no good. He said that insults and violence never fixed anything. The giant roared with laughter. He asked Bloom what the answer was if force was no good. Bloom looked at the angry faces around him. He said simply that the answer was love. He said it was the opposite of hatred. The room went quiet for a second. Then the men exploded with laughter. They mocked Bloom. They thought he was weak. How could a man talk about love in a world of fighting? The citizen turned purple with rage. He could not understand this small, peaceful man. Bloom was a threat to his world of anger. Bloom realized it was time to leave. He walked out the door to catch a carriage. The giant was furious. He stood up, knocking his chair over. He grabbed a heavy tin box from the table. It was a biscuit tin, hard and sharp. The giant ran to the door. He shouted a curse at Bloom. He threw the heavy box with all his might. It flew through the air like a missile. It was a rock thrown by a monster. The box missed Bloom by an inch. It crashed onto the street and clattered loudly. The sun was bright in the giant's eyes, blinding him. Bloom jumped onto the carriage. The horses pulled him away. Bloom sat back, his heart beating fast. He had walked into the cave of the giant and he had survived. He had faced the music that made him sad, and he had faced the man who wanted to hurt him. He was not a soldier with a sword. He was just a man with a kind heart. But on this day, in the dark and noisy city, that was enough to make him a hero. The carriage rolled on, taking him away from the hate, back into the flowing stream of the city. In Chapter 6, Twilight on the Beach. The bright sun of the afternoon began to fade. The angry shouts of the giant and the noise of the busy streets were far behind now. Leopold Bloom found a quiet place to rest. He walked down to the edge of the sea, to a place called Sandamount Strand. The water was calm. The sky turned a soft, dusty gray. It was the hour of twilight, that special time between day and night when shapes become blurry and the world feels quiet. Bloom was tired. The day had been long and full of hard feelings. He sat down on a rock near the sand. The air smelled of salt and seaweed. He watched the gentle waves roll in, one after another, never stopping. On the rocks nearby, 3 girls were playing. 2 of them were loud and running about, chasing a ball. But one girl sat very still. Her name was Gertie MacDowell. She was young and beautiful, with large eyes and hair that caught the last light of the sun. Gertie was a girl who loved stories. She read magazines about romance and true love. She dreamed of a handsome gentleman who would come and take her away from her simple life. Gertie saw the dark stranger sitting alone on the rock. She did not see a middle-aged man who sold advertisements. She did not see a man who had been chased away from a pub. In the dim gray light, her imagination took over. She saw a sad, mysterious prince. She saw a man with a broken heart who needed comfort. Bloom watched her, too. He was not looking for romance, but he was lonely. He admired her youth. He watched her from a distance, and she watched him. They did not speak a word. It was a silent conversation across the sand. Suddenly, a bright light shot into the sky. It was a firework from a nearby bazaar. A Roman candle burst in green and gold sparks against the gray clouds. Gertie leaned back to watch the lights, knowing Bloom was looking at her. For a moment, it felt like magic. It was a projected mirage, a beautiful picture that was not quite real. Then the fireworks faded. The sky went dark. Gertie stood up to leave with her friends. As she walked away, Bloom saw that she walked with a limp. One of her legs was hurt. The illusion of the perfect princess vanished. She was just a real girl with her own pains, and he was just an older man. The gray evening swallowed the romance, leaving only the truth. Bloom felt a little sad, but also calm. He wrote a message in the sand with a stick, but he knew the tide would soon wash it away. Bloom remembered he had a duty to perform. A woman named Mrs. Purifoy was at the hospital nearby. She had been in labor for 3 days, trying to bring a baby into the world. Bloom wanted to see if she was safe. He stood up and walked toward the city. The setting changed completely. He left the open, gray beach and entered the large, stone building on Halls Street. This was the hospital. Inside, the air was different. It smelled of medicine and soap. The colors changed from the soft gray of the beach to a stark, clean white. The walls were white. The nurses wore white. It was the house of life. Bloom walked into a waiting room. There was a big table in the center. Sitting around it were several young men. They were medical students. Among them was Stephen Dedalus, the young man Bloom had seen earlier in the library. The room was loud. The students were drinking beer and shouting jokes. They banged their cups on the table. They talked about biology and birth, but they made it sound like a game. They did not seem to care about the suffering of the women upstairs. Bloom sat down quietly in the corner. He felt out of place. He looked at Stephen. Stephen was smart, but he was drinking too much. He was wasting his words on these loud students. Bloom felt a pang in his heart. He thought about his own son, Ruddy, who had died when he was a baby. If Ruddy had lived, he would be a young man now. Bloom looked at Stephen and wished he could be a father to him. He wanted to tell him to be careful, to take care of his talent. The chapter of the hospital was about the cycle of life. It was about the womb, the place where life begins. Time seemed to move differently here. Outside, the night was getting old. Inside, they were waiting for something new to begin. Bloom thought about how we are all born helpless, how we grow strong, how we make noise like these students, and how we eventually grow old and quiet. Suddenly, the door opened. A nurse came in. She looked tired but happy. She told them the news. Mrs. Purifoy had finally given birth. It was a son. The long struggle was over. Life had won against the pain. Bloom felt a sense of relief. A new life had started in the white room upstairs. The cycle continued. At that moment, a loud crack of thunder shook the building. The dry weather broke. Rain began to pour down outside, heavy and loud. It washed over the streets and the roof of the hospital. The storm had arrived, signaling the end of the long waiting. Bloom and Stephen stood up. It was time to move again. Chapter 7. The Magic of Nighttown. The heavy rain stopped, but it left a thick mist hanging over Dublin. It was midnight. The city did not look like the city anymore. The street lamps glowed with a strange, violet light. It was a purple fog that made everything look like a dream. This was Nighttown. It was the part of the city where people went to hide, to drink, and to do things they would not do in the daylight. Leopold Bloom followed Stephen Dedalus into this maze of narrow, dark streets. Bloom was tired. His legs felt heavy. This was the hour when the body is exhausted, but the mind runs wild. The skeleton of the day was breaking down. Bloom was worried about Stephen. The young man was drunk and had run away from the hospital. He was carrying too much sadness for one person. Bloom felt like a father looking for a lost child. As Bloom walked through the violet fog, the world began to change. The laws of nature stopped working. This was the magic of the night. Thoughts did not stay inside the head anymore. They jumped out and became real people. Bloom passed a dark corner. Suddenly, he saw his own father, Virag, but his father was dead. Yet there he stood, wearing an old coat. He pointed a finger at Bloom. "Leopold," his father shouted, "you are spending too much money. You are wasting your life." Bloom tried to shake his head to make the vision go away. But then he saw his wife, Molly. She was dressed in Turkish clothes, looking like a queen. She laughed at him. Even the bar of soap in Bloom's pocket seemed to speak. It sang a little song about being clean. Bloom was dizzy. His guilt and his fears were walking on the street beside him. He finally found Stephen in a noisy house. It was a brothel. There was a piano playing by itself in the corner. Women with painted faces were dancing. The room was hot and smelled of old perfume and smoke. Stephen stood in the middle of the room. He looked pale and sick. He was talking to the air, moving his hands as if he were fighting invisible enemies. Then the magic turned dark for Stephen. The air grew cold. From the floor, a figure rose up. It was Stephen's mother. She was dead, but here she was. She wore the dirty clothes of the grave. Her face was thin and wasted, just like when she died. She smelled like wax and dead flowers. "Kneel down, Stephen," the ghost said. Her voice was hollow. "Pray for me. You must repent." Stephen covered his eyes. He was terrified. His guilt was eating him alive. He had refused to pray when she was dying, and now she was back to haunt him. "No," Stephen screamed. "No, I will not serve." The ghost moved closer, reaching out with a cold hand. Stephen could not take it anymore. He grabbed his walking stick. He shouted a word of anger and swung the stick high. He hit the gas chandelier that hung from the ceiling. Smash. The glass broke into 1,000 pieces. The light went out. The room fell into chaos. People screamed. The magic spell was broken by violence. Stephen ran out the door into the street. Bloom ran after him, his heart pounding in his chest. Outside, Stephen ran into 2 British soldiers. They were tall and angry. Stephen, still drunk and confused, tried to argue with them. He spoke about kings and history. The soldiers did not understand him. They thought he was insulting their king. One of the soldiers raised his fist. He punched Stephen in the face. Stephen fell to the wet ground like a sack of potatoes. He lay there, silent and still. Bloom arrived just in time. He stood over Stephen, protecting him. He spoke calmly to the soldiers and to the people watching. He made the soldiers leave. Now it was just Bloom and Stephen. Bloom looked down at the young man sleeping in the dirt. Stephen's coat was muddy. He looked so young and helpless. Bloom felt a deep ache in his heart. The cycle of the day was ending. The body had fallen. Then the violet light played one last trick. As Bloom looked at Stephen, the air shimmered. Bloom saw a vision. It was not a scary ghost this time. It was a little boy. He was 11 years old. He was dressed in a fine wool suit. He held a book in his hand and looked peaceful. It was Ruddy. It was Bloom's son who had died when he was a baby. If he had lived, he would look just like this. The boy smiled silently at Bloom. For a moment, the father and the lost son were together in the quiet street. Bloom reached out his hand, but the boy was gone. There was only Stephen, breathing slowly on the ground. Bloom stood guard over him in the silent, dark city. The long day was over. The two men, the father and the son, had finally found each other in the end.